Today we are going to walk through Discussion Forum 6. We're in the thick of our study of deductive logic. More specifically, we are studying categorical syllogisms in categorical logic and moving on to a discussion of propositional logic, which will set the stage for our discussion of natural deduction. Now, these two systems, or two versions of deductive logic, are systems in which the way that we treat our ordinary English sentences reveals to us specific logical features or logical structures of our language. That then allows us to think about within these systems how it is that an argument does or does not preserve the truth of its conclusion by way of those logical structures. So for this week's discussion forum prompt choices, we're going to first look at how an argument, or more specifically a categorical syllogism that is invalid, can still be evaluated under an inductive evaluation concept, strength and weakness, can still be evaluated as strong. And we want to talk about how that discussion is going to, I hope anyway, clarify our understanding of the distinction between a valid and an invalid argument. Then, for our other prompt choices, we are going to look at the logical structure of our language from the standpoint of logical connectives. And those are what drive our study of propositional or sentential logic, which is which are the building blocks for natural deduction. So let's go ahead and take a look at our prompts and how we're going to approach our original contribution, our original post, and then our peer reply. Okay, so as you can see, you have a handful of prompt choices from which to choose to work on for your original contribution. And then, as is pretty customary for us, your reply, peer response, your peer reply, is going to involve addressing a classmate's post which involves a discussion of a prompt different from the one that you chose. So let's focus on what each of the prompts says and what's involved in tackling the assignment. So we're going to read through each of our prompts and then we'll discuss them. First, explain why the following syllogism, though invalid, would be considered strong under an inductive reasoning interpretation. The argument runs as follows. Since some cats are animals and some animals are carnivores, it follows that some cats are carnivores. Next, explain why denying the antecedent is a formal fallacy. Next, explain why affirming the consequent is a formal fallacy. The second to last prompt asks you to explain the difference between only and the only, and the final prompt asks you to explain the difference between if, then, and only if. Let's go ahead and look at each in turn. We'll map out a little bit of what it is that I'm asking you to do. Okay, so let's start with our first prompt choice. We've already read through it. So what you might think about doing is this: reorganizing the argument so that you lay it out in standard form for a categorical syllogism. And then remember that we're talking in terms of validity about the distinction between the form of the argument and the content. So even though the content of this argument, each of the sentences, the two premises and the conclusion, are all true, it's still the case that the form of the argument is such that the premises do not guarantee the conclusion. You can test this argument, you can demonstrate invalidity by way of the rules of the syllogism, or Venn diagramming. You can also use the counterexample method, where you provide an instance of an argument with the same form as you see here, but the content is different, and the premises are actually true and the conclusion is actually false. So you're showing the argument is invalid. So what I'm asking you to do is think about how the argument, while invalid, is still strong, and what that has to do with the content of the argument. In other words, what experience teaches us about the conclusion. For our second and third prompt choices, we are moving on to natural deduction. More specifically, we're looking at two formal fallacies. That is, two ways in which in propositional logic an argument fails, an argument is invalid. So the two that I have presented you here are so common and that they each have their own name, and they are common fallacies because they mimic or are close to valid argument forms. So you know that the conditional claim is represented in terms of the left side of the arrow, which is called the antecedent, and the right side of the arrow, which is called the consequent. So we have sentences such as, if I have 10 pennies, then I have 10 cents. Then in the argument, that is going to be the one the denying of the antecedent mimics. The antecedent is affirmed, which yields the consequent. So this argument form is called the mode of affirmation, or affirming the antecedent, or modus ponens. The fallacy, as I said, it sort of mimics this valid argument form. So here we have the same first premise, but then the second premise denies the antecedent, and the erroneous inference is that the consequence is thereby denied. So what you want to do is explain the mechanism whereby this formal fallacy occurs. The second of the two related formal fallacies that you could discuss is the fallacy known as affirming the consequent. So as a reminder, we have a fallacy that involves the, in this case, affirming of part of a conditional claim. And we'll use the same conditional claim as we used in the prior example. Here, however, notice that in the second premise, there is a denial of the consequent, which yields a denial of the antecedent. And sorry about the typo, and it should not be cast, it should be case. In any event, this argument form is commonly called mode of denial, or modus tollens. So when we affirm the consequent, what we're doing is, rather than denying the consequent, we're saying, yes, in this case, I have 10 cents. And we thereby erroneously infer the antecedent, which is that I therefore have 10 pennies. So here again, you want to explain the mechanism whereby this argument fails. Of the last two choices, the last two choices involve focusing on necessary and sufficient conditions. So in the first of the last two, we have the word and phrase respectively only and the only. So here are some ways that you can start to think about what I'm asking you to do when I ask you to explain the difference between the two. Let's suppose that we have the following universal affirmative claim, all dogs are animals. Then we have the claim, only service dogs are dogs allowed in the market. And the only dogs allowed in the market are service dogs. So ask yourself, how it is that you would reformulate the second and third examples so that you have the universal affirmative standard form structure. Another way you could think about it is, as I mentioned before, talking about the difference between necessary and sufficient conditions. More specifically, in the case of a quantified statement or categorical proposition, what you'd want to think about is the relationship between the subject class and the predicate class. And then finally, we return to the conditional claim. So what we're talking about is the relationship between the antecedent and the consequent in terms of the appearance of the if and the then, the order of them, if you will, and the phrase only if, the order of the appearance of that phrase. So think about the following. You can have a sentence that reads as follows: if this, then that. You can also have X only if, let's say, Y, right? What's the difference in terms of the expression only if between the two? Don't forget that the left side of the arrow, or the if part of a conditional claim, is called the antecedent. More specifically, it's what comes after the if. And then the then part of the conditional claim, or what comes after the then, or the implied then, is called the consequent. And the appearance of each is respectively the left and the right side of an arrow, if you want to start formalizing the sentence. So what I'm asking you to do is to think in terms of how the expression only if and how the if-then relation will tell us something about the necessary condition or the sufficient condition that's thereby expressed. So the sufficient condition is standardly articulated in the antecedent position, and the necessary condition is standardly articulated in the consequent position.